Well, it became obvious that Vladimir Putin is not a reformer, and he's not going to establish liberal democracy in Russia. There were two basic strategies of stigmatization of his policies in economy. The first one dealt with revision of the results of privatizations, and suppose that instead of normal market economy, he's going to restore some sort of state economy in Russia, state capitalism. The second way of stigmatization of Putin was the idea that sooner or later he will be forced to turn to Soviet-style politics of redistribution of resource rent and so on. And both strategies were rooted in discussions and cleavages of the 90s. And those discussions suppose that the main threat for reforms is the restoration of Soviet-style economy or something like that. But actually, Putin's story, the story of Putin's regime and his economic policy is quite different. It is in a very different perspective. And this is the perspective, I suppose, is that the political economy of personalistic authoritarianism. You know, the personalistic authoritarianism is the most productive and most popular form of authoritarian regime in the modern world. And it always deals very much with political economy. And I think that this sphere, this problem is not investigated, researched enough now. It's lack of research on this. And so I want to say something on that and to trace this idea of personalistic dictatorship in Putin's political economy. I'm going briefly, retrospect briefly some periods with how it developed and emerged, because there were different periods with different ideas. So the very first period, I call Great Beginnings. It deals with the first years of Putin's presidency, and that was the time when Putin was presented to the public as both the statist and the reformer. And he had a great big coalition because he, at the same time, he fought against oligarchs and deprivatized some property that was not even officially privatized. And at the same time, he was concerned with he was devoted to reforms and made some reforms with tax code, new tax code, and some other reforms from Gref's famous reform program. It was the very first period. The second period is called Great Turn, and it deals with this period from 2002 to 2003 and a few years after that. So the problem was, the story was that while Putin's friends, while Putin captured and consolidated asserts of Gazprom and Russian railroads, he established two monopolies, and his friends became the heads of those monopolies. And in contrast with expectations of liberal reformists, Putin rejected the reforms of those monopolies and consolidated them. And so it became obvious that he's bringing up new oligarchs instead of old ones. And next years, in 2004, 2005, you know, and it was described already, it was deprivatization of Yukos and of Sibneft in different ways, as you know, in different manners, but both were deprivatized, and new oil company was created. So it's the period of consolidation of control and especially in the sphere of oil and gas. But besides those very famous cases of Yukos and others, there were several cases of deprivatization of industrial assets. For example, this this United Heavy Machinery Group of Kakhat and Dukidze and some other industrial assets were deprivatized at that time, from 2003 till 2006 in this period. The next period, and that was the period when oil prices were rising and growth rates increasing. You see there. This next period is very important, and I call it great expectations, or great illusions, maybe is better. It is about this period when oil prices were rocketing and very high growth rates were, and there were some strategy, Putin's strategy at that moment, that that explained and excused deprivatization. The problem was that first, it was based on two ideas. The first idea was that Russia is great, is energy superpower, and it has huge resources and could sell it, export it, and then redistribute the revenues from this export in purpose of reindustrialization. And that was the moment when those state corporations were founded. Sorry, may I take water? So, and that was already described what state corporations are actually, and this is, I think, this is the core, the most essential part of Putin's political economy, because actually they are not state and they are not private. They are state assets that are managed like private, and this is the main idea of Putin's assets management. They were free. State corporations were free from both state and corporate control. Actually, the only man who could control it is the person who appointed the management. That was the third period, and it is very important because this Putin's corporatism emerged, developed in this period. And this corporatism is based on the integration of different types of quasi-state-owned property, quasi-state-owned assets. This period, yes, and yes. The next period is very important. It is the period of great disillusionment. I mean that in this period, the crisis of 2008 demonstrated the vulnerability of oil prices, and though they soon rise again, the situation was not so favorable, and shale gas problems also emerged in that moment. They understood that the shale gas is real perspective, and so the energy price, oil prices wouldn't be so high as they expected in the previous period, because there was the idea in this period of great illusion that about $100 per barrel it will be new normal for oil. But it became obvious that it wouldn't be so in this. It wouldn't be so in this second period of disillusionment, and the idea of reindustrialization and of energy superpower, they failed, both ideas in that moment. But in fact, it was the pivotal point for Russian elites, because they found it out in crisis of 2008 and 2009. That oil price downfall is not crucial for the economy. And it became more obvious when in 2009, 2010, in 2010 and 2011, the oil prices were rising again. So they understood that all that, the threat of oil price downfall is not so. It is not so big problem, and we can survive. And that was the moment when the idea of self-sufficient economy arose. And that idea was very important for Putin's elite in this period, and they just get it in this moment. And it was the new vision of Russian economy, and basically new idea of it. At the same time, the new projects emerged in this time, in this period. The project of development of infrastructural development ideas. It's now not about reindustrialization, but about infrastructure development. This is another way of how to use oil and gas revenue is in oil-abundant countries, very, very famous, and they took this idea. And this new set of oligarchic campaign emerged at that moment. This connected with Württemberg, this Olympic Games project, and so on. And that was a new form of new corporatist set of companies. So, and that idea, that ideology of self-sufficiency was the basis of new turn in Putin's politics when he returned back to the position of president, and this new vision of Russia and the annexation of Crimea. The annexation of Crimea and confrontation with the West had drastically changed the situation within Russian elites, and they reflected this new vision of Russia as self-sufficient country, which had not any need in some Western type reforms. But also the West was regarded as something dangerous, and it was regarded as some expansion of values and financial infrastructure. So the idea of isolation and self-sufficiency became very important for Putin's group, and so the confrontation was reasonable idea, reasonable choice for them. The Crimea annexation drastically changed the situation within Russian elites, because in that moment Western-oriented elites, or elites with mobile capital, a capital which is both within the country and on external markets, those elites they drastically lost their political weight, while those elites with fixed capital within the country, they became much more politically powerful. And now we see the attempts and efforts to make Russian economy more isolated. And for example, Parin-Vostok case is also we can interpret this in this manner. And what is this story is about? It is about some Putin's corporate state, which was first emerged in this period from 2004 2008, but in that time it was excused. It was excused and explained as a state corporation as state. In terms of development. So we create this set of state corporations for development, for reindustrialization. This is one of the strategy of emerging markets countries catching up. But it was the first period, 2004-2008. But the same corporate state was explained, in the second period in a different way, as it is a state corporation, state as corporation, as a set of corporations. But the goal is different. The goal is to withstand to West and to confront with the West and so something like that. What is this corporate state? What is the most important part of this corporate state? This is a sort of oligarchic circles. The most important is what about the main Putin's understanding of property. There are three types of property rights in Russia. There are state property, quasi-state property, and quasi-private property, and their interaction makes this system of corporate estate. The second important story is about this infrastructural and development companies, which makes very important, which plays very important role, because this left circuit, it is about mostly about resources export and how the money from it redistributed within the country. And the second one is about the control of domestic market, which became big enough, the consumption market. And this is, you see also the model that the budget gives money to infrastructure companies to develop infrastructure. And the same company, they became the major in commercial development. And in this way, they control retail holdings. And retail. So, what is the most important thing about this state property? Why the state property? Why the private property? This is the main Putin's strategy in politics and in economy. The main strategy of management. It is always based on two channels, formal and informal, and they always coexist. Some formal connections and informal connections. Formal way of pressure and informal. And it is very important that the main figure, the strong man, is the man who can switch up from formal to informal channels of management and vice versa. And this is the strong man position, because he is the head of informal hierarchies and formal hierarchies, and manage between them, switching from one to one. And this is his exceptional position, his strong position within the system. I think that's all.